Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to bring you a great webinar today, Killer Fashion, the Plume Boom, Female Activism, and Bird Conservation, presented by Jenn Yerkes, better known as Madame Les Fruits de Mer. So a couple of quick housekeeping notes. If you have questions for Jenn during the talk, please type them in the Q&A panel, and Jenn will answer them at the end of her talk. And we are very grateful to have with us Adriana Tosses, who will be doing closed caption translation to Spanish. So look for this option in your Zoom toolbar and choose it if you would like to see translation. All right, a little bit about BirdsCaribbean. I'm Lisa Sorensen. I'm Executive Director of BirdsCaribbean. And BirdsCaribbean is a nonprofit dedicated to conserving birds and nature in all the islands of the Caribbean. We raise awareness, we promote science, and we empower our local partners to build a region where people care about birds, conserve them, and benefit from healthy ecosystems. If you're not familiar with us, I invite you to check out our websites and learn more about us and follow us on social media. All right, throughout the fall, we are celebrating World Migratory Bird Day. And this is hosted in the Western Hemisphere by Environment for the Americas. The theme this year is Birds Connect Our World, which I think is so true in this year in particular with the pandemic. Everybody's tuned into birds this year, which is awesome. For our Caribbean celebration, we're hosting webinars like this one, and we've had a campaign sharing a migratory bird of the day for the last 2 months. On our website, there's lots of great info for learning at home, including natural history information on migratory birds, online puzzles, coloring pages, and activities for kids, videos, bird calls, and more. So do check us out. And now on to the talk. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today, Jenn Yerkes. Jenn is the president of Les Fruits de Mer, a nonprofit association based in St. Martin, whose mission is to raise awareness about the island's nature, culture, and heritage. Jenn is the co-curator of Amuseum Naturalis, which is St. Martin's free nature and heritage museum. She is the co-creator of Amuseum at Home, which is a free, fun home learning program about St. Martin's nature and heritage. Jenn's ongoing research and writing and outreach project is to uncover and share the stories of the unsung heroes of Caribbean natural history. Jenn will share with us today the story of how birds were slaughtered for fashion at the turn of the century and how this led to the birth of our modern bird conservation movement. Welcome, Jenn.
Hi, and welcome everybody else. Thank you, Lisa. So killer fashion is our talk today. And this is basically the story of how in America, the environmental and conservation movement grew out of fashion and was driven by women. And to this day, these movements and laws help protect migratory and resident birds in the Caribbean and around the world. So we're about to go back in time to check out a lot of crazy feather fashions. So get ready, y'all. We're mostly going to be talking about the turn of the 20th century here, because that's when a lot of this drama went down. But before the turn of the 20th century, feathers had already been used to create clothing and accessories for centuries. And in many cultures, they were a symbol of high status and power. In Roman times, they had feathers as a part of the high-ranking officers' uniforms. So those puffy things on their helmets that you see, those are plumes. In Polynesia, there are special feathered cloaks and helmets that are only for the chiefs. And in Africa, feathers have been used for hundreds of years to create traditional ceremonial headdresses, like this one from the Bamileke tribe. And American and Caribbean indigenous peoples used feathers for ritual garments and special headdresses for their leaders. For centuries, Chinese emperors or special ones made of kingfisher feathers. What you're looking at is a empress, so about the 11th century. And that blue that you're looking at on her head, that turquoisey blue, that's the special kingfisher crown. So empresses only. And this guy with the fancy plumes on his turban and horse, he was a grand vizier of the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. And on the right, we see a powerful noble from 17th century India. So he's wearing a jeweled feather ornament on his head. You can see that there. So across cultures and across time, feathers were a symbol of status and wealth. As Europeans began colonizing, they were exposed to feather traditions in other places, and they got access to the feathers themselves. So there's really a significant tie to the colonial exploitation of places, people, and resources here. That colonial exploitation element of European feather fashion. It's not like using feathers for fashion was the new thing. It was more the sheer of control. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, feathers just blow up. They become a massive, massive fashion trend in North America and Europe. And the style and hats for these times, it was these ginormous, wide concoctions, and feathers became the most sought after decoration for these giant hats, which makes sense in a way because if you have a giant hat and you're gonna pile a bunch of stuff on top of that giant hat, it would be better if that stuff was not very heavy. And birds have evolved feathers over millions of years to be not only beautiful, but also lightweight and strong. So if you want to put a lot of something on a hat, feathers can seem like a good choice. And you can fit a lot of feathers on a hat like this. But the mania for decorating hats was not just for feathers. They sing entire wing, or just a whole taxidermied bird on your hat, or flocks of taxidermied birds. I know. Okay, let's do a killer fashion quiz. Your question is, and Lisa, I think this is where you have a poll that could pop up. Yes. So your question is, in the 19th century, every British blank wore snowy egret feathers. Tell me what you think on your screen. Do you think it is A, bride, B, showgirl, C, infantryman, D, housekeeper, or E, barrister?
All right. The answers are coming in. Everybody, please tell us what you think. This is going to be interesting.
We're going to have quizzes kind of throughout this.
All right, we'll give you a few more seconds. Still waiting for the last few people to vote. Get your votes in. Let's see who got this one right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, and here's the results.
Okay. Did everyone get a good look at it? The top choice seems to be bride here.
Yes.
Followed by showgirl, then infantryman. No one thinks housekeepers. Every housekeeper is going to wear the feathers. And we had a few for barrister. All right, so you will get the answer in this presentation. So how do I close the poll? How does that work?
I did close it, just there's a little bit of a lag.
Okay.
Keep going.
Is poll still coming up on your screen? Or just on my screen? No. Okay. So women were not the only ones wearing feathers on their heads and in their fashions in the 19th century. Feathers were also used in men's hats and fashions, including many military uniforms. So those fluffy things on their heads are feathers. Okay, here it is. So every British infantryman, so people who voted for C, British infantrymen, you guys are part of their uniform. They use the feathers of the Snowy Egret. So if you think about how many people were in that army, that's a lot of egrets. All right, so now it's time for another quiz. This one is a true or false. And your question is true or false? True or false, at the turn of the 20th century, American and European ladies wore dead bodies as jewelry. Do you think it's true or do you think it's false?
All right, hopefully you guys can see the poll. Oh, wait, hold on, here it comes. Sorry about that.
True or false, at the turn of the 20th century, American and European ladies wore dead bodies as jewelry.
Okay. All right, couple more seconds. Almost everybody's voted. Here's the results.
All right, we have 95% saying it's true, saying these ladies did not wear dead bodies as jewelry. Feathers, wings, and whole birds were used for other things besides hats. They started using them to decorate high-end fans. So here we can see some fancy feather fans that they're holding. And these are some late Victorian fans. So if you look carefully, you can see there are entire little hummingbirds on these fans. Here's a depressing close-up for you. We can see this fan has feathers and down that's being used to decorate it, as well as the whole little birds. Feathers and birds were also used for muffs, capes, dresses, and even jewelry and hairpins. So there's your answer. This white filmy thing on this lady's head, this is a hair ornament that's made out of Snowy Egret. And you can see she's also wearing like a little capelet or a stole that's trimmed around the neck with feathers as well. And there would be people who had whole hummingbirds or little songbirds surrounded by jewels, and that would be a brooch. This is a pair of earrings made from the heads of two red-legged honey creepers. So these must be males in breeding plumage because they have that turquoise cap. So if anyone here is from Cuba or Trinidad and Tobago, you know these little guys. Look, they put gold on their beaks. It's hard to imagine sort of like walking around, bejeweling yourself with little corpses, you know, like off with their heads, let's go to the ball. But they did. Here you can see a muff and a stole made of seabirds. Yeah. So at this time, most American and European men and women were expected to wear hats when they left the house. Like you look in this picture, like everyone's got a hat, it's hats all around. You know, a bare head would be scandalous. So hats were a product people were buying. Some lower class women might have one or two hats for their whole lifetime. Middle class women might buy one hat or a handful of hats a year. But wealthy upper class women, they might change hats several times a day. So you had hats for riding horses, riding in carriages, hats for promenading, hats for making afternoon visits. You had hats for the theater or the opera. And then if someone in your family died, you would have mourning hats. So hats that were black, all the same hats as before, but like black. And then you had fancy hair ornaments and things like that for evening. So And as a fancy upper class lady, you also needed new hats, all of those hats every season. So on the left, we have some winter hats, and on the right, we have some spring hats. So we're talking about a lot of hats and a lot of money. And these feathered hats are really luxury items. They're being snapped up by people with money who were hungry for more and more feathered fashions. And as the trend creeps and getting more out of control, this feather market balloons to keep up with the demand. Feathers become big business, and that was not good news for birds. The plume boom, that's the name that people use, what they call the explosion of the feather trade that happened at this time in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Feathers became a multi-million-dollar a year industry. And that was in like back then money, not today money. So $1 million in the year 1900 would be about $31 million in today's money. So if this was a multi-million-dollar a year industry back then, you can start to imagine the scale of how much money this was making for people. It was huge. So we're gonna have a quiz about money. And this quiz is in 1903, an ounce of feathers was worth about how much in today's dollars? So an ounce for you people on the metric system, that's about 28 grams. So how much is an ounce of feathers worth in today's dollars? Do you think it's $100, $300, $500, or $1,000?
This is a tough one, Jen.
I know.
They're doing pretty well. All right, keep the votes coming in. A few more still to go. No looking things up on the internet, that's cheating. All right, couple more seconds. Almost everybody's voted. All right, here we go. Let's see how everybody did.
Okay, interesting.
So were they correct?
You'll find out in a minute.
All right.
What I will say is that the prices that could be charged for feathers and plumes, these prices were astronomical. In 1886, they were selling for more than $20 an ounce, which is more than 500 bucks in today's money. And by the way, this is wholesale. This is not retail. And by the early 20th century, so to 1903, that had gone up to $32 an ounce, which is almost $1,000 in today's money. So everyone who said $1,000, you were right on the money, so to speak. But this price, this crazy price at the time, it made feathers worth literally twice their weight in gold. And later, the price went up to $80 an ounce, which is more than $2,000 in today's money. So people were making bank on this. It was bonkers. And there were so many layers to this super rich industry. Hat shops and dressmakers where the fanciest customers came to buy hats and couture, like this fancy hat shop. And then you had department stores. Department stores were just kind of getting started. And you had more affordable stores as well. Like, look at the case in this department store. It's like full of dead birds, right? You had shops that specialized just in feathers. And then you also had millinery supply stores that sold supplies for hat making. So obviously they'd be selling a ton of feathers, wings, and birds as well. You had the hat making or the feather making and plume industries, so that anything that prepared or dyed or curled feathers or put different feathers together to make fancier plumes. This is an ad for a feather dyer. So they specialized in bleaching and dyeing feathers different colors. In 1889, over 8,000 women were working in the millinery trade in London and Paris. By 1900, there were 83,000 people employed in New York City alone in hat making and decoration. So that's a big change. And the majority of them were women. And at one point, 1 in every 1,000 people employed in the US was working in the feather trade. I mean, this is the scale of this industry. And the feather prep part of this industry employed a lot of women as well. And it was not the healthiest work due to all the fluff and chemicals. There were higher end feather preparers, and then there were plume sweatshops like these. And there were a lot of immigrant women who were employed in these plume sweatshops. It was not a great period for workers' rights. You also had the feather traders and warehouses that supplied feathers and birds to the industry. And finally, there were the people that got the feathers for the feather traders. These people were called plume hunters. There were even celebrity plume hunters. So here's a newspaper article that was written in 1898 about one of these celebrity plume hunters. His name was David Egret Bennett. So Egret was his nickname, celebrity nickname. So let's do a quiz about David Egret Bennett. We're gonna see how much money this dude was making in the early part of the plume boom. So the question is, for 7 months of plume hunting in 1882, David Egret Bennett made about this much in today's money. Do you think it was 25 grand, 50 grand, 75 grand, 100 grand? How much did he make for 7 months in 1882 in today dollars? Let's see what you think.
All right, numbers are coming in. I guess it was just seasonal work, Jen, but I think it probably paid well. All right, a few more seconds, get your answers in, and then we'll share the results. Here we go. And the winner is?
It looks like everybody voted for 100 grand. We have a few stragglers for 75 grand and 50 grand. It's not a bad guess because this is just the beginning. You know, this is just the beginning of the plume boom in 1882. It's before stuff really kicks off. So in 1882, David Bennett made $3,900 from 7 months of plume hunting in Nicaragua. And that is, in fact, almost 100 grand in today's money. So plume hunters were just making insane amounts of cash. Like they built mansions from it. And again, this is at the start of the plume boom. So imagine what these plume hunters were making when the feather prices went up. It's, yeah, it's pretty bonkers. And as it turns out, these plume hunters were not going down to Florida and the Caribbean and Central America and strolling around after gorgeous birds, just hoping that a feather or two would drop out. They were killing the birds. So here's another plume hunter, Lee Pearsall. He's in Florida and he has just shot a black-crowned night heron for the feather trade. Yeah. This whole hugely profitable industry was built on the almost entirely unregulated, so no rules, slaughter of hundreds of millions of birds across the globe. Hundreds of millions. This plume boom, it just massively decimated bird populations all across the Americas and the Caribbean. And by the start of the 20th century, there were many species that were almost totally annihilated by it, including the snowy egret. In 1886, which is the early part of the plume boom, already over 5 million birds a year were being slaughtered just for the North American millinery trade or hat making business. In retail stores on Ladies Mile, this is the main shopping district in New York City at the time. It was called Ladies Mile. But you could go into stores like Madame Foucher's and buy feathers from snowy egrets, white ibises, great blue herons, like you name it, you could find it in these stores. And there was a bird watcher who lived in New York City at this time. His name was Frank Chapman, and he was 22 years old. And he did a fascinating kind of field study on the streets of New York that same year, 1886. It was fascinating, but it was also totally depressing because he was like, I love birds, I'm a bird watcher, but I can just go outside my house and watch dead birds on people's heads. So that's what he did for his field study on 2 afternoons. He was like, I'm gonna walk from my office in Uptown Manhattan down Fifth Avenue to the ladies' fashion district on 14th Street. And I'm gonna look at people's heads, like I'm gonna look at their hats. And he saw that 3/4 of the hats he observed had feathers. He counted the stuffed dead birds on people, and altogether up 174 dead birds and 40 species. That's just 2 afternoons, something that can help give you an idea of the volume of what was going on. Another way to check out the volume is to look at records of hat makers and feather traders from the time, and imagine the scale of death it represents. It's pretty mind-blowing. For example, a single shipment to just one London hat maker was 32,000 dead hummingbirds, 80,000 aquatic birds, and 800,000 pairs of wings. So that's just one shipment to one hat maker in one place during this period. Egret feathers were super popular with these feather traders. So let's do an egret quiz. Feather trader egret quiz. How many dead egrets does it take to give you an ounce of feathers? What do you think? How many egrets do you have to, if you're a plume hunter and you're like, okay, I want an ounce of feathers that I can sell for $1,000 or $2,000 equivalent, like how many egrets do you have to kill for that?
I'm challenged by this one, Jen. No idea.
This is like sad math.
But I have a feeling it's not good, the answer.
It's always sad math when you're making this kind of calculation.
Okay, the answers are coming in. A few more seconds, everybody. Take your guess. How many dead snowy egrets to get 1 ounce of feathers? A few more seconds. All right, let's see how everybody did. Here's the results.
Okay. So it looks like most of you get the sad correct answer, which is, I mean, all the answers are sad, but it's 4. So you have to kill 4 snowy egrets to get an ounce of feathers. There was a guy, his name was W.T. Hornaday. He was an ornithologist who looked at a lot of these records like we were just talking about. And he was able to calculate that 129,168 snowy egrets were slaughtered for the London plume markets alone in just one 9-month period. So again, that's a ton of money and a ton of egrets. And similar volume was happening in these feather auctions in New York City at this plume boom time. London and New York were like the biggest, most rapacious centers for the feather trade. And there were a ton of egrets that were killed for it because their feathers were very fashionable. And one reason for that is when egrets are breeding, they have this beautiful, filmy, fancy breeding plumage. You can see it in that picture. And it's white. So if you want white feathers, you do not have to bleach them. If you want to dye them different colors, you don't have to bleach them first and then dye them. It saves you a step. And this made egret feathers tremendously popular in the trade. And it's for this reason that the species was massacred almost to extinction during this plume boom. And plume hunters would travel to places like Florida and the Caribbean to slaughter snowy egrets during nesting season. Egrets nest in colonies, so there's a big group of them all together. And that makes it really convenient if you're a plume hunter and you want to get a ton of feathers at once. And these plume hunters, they would go during nesting season for another reason as well. And it's because the egrets still have their breeding plumage. They still have these fancy feathers that they were sought after for. And the hunters would wait until the eggs hatched and the egrets were taking care of their chicks. Because the egrets at that point were less likely to move and go away. They were taking care of their children. You know, both parents take care of the kids for snowy egrets. So the hunters would wait until this was happening. And then they would go in and wipe out whole colonies. They would shoot and skin the adults, and they would leave the helpless children who were unable to fly to starve to death in the nest or be eaten by predators. And there are a lot of contemporary accounts of this hunting technique, specifically for snowy egrets, but also for other birds, where they describe in this really heart-wrenching way these poor chicks, you know, desperate, starving, calling out to their parents who are dead and can't come, and finally dying in despair. It was pretty brutal. And this technique is not a sustainable technique. If you're trying to exploit a resource and you wipe out any chance of it continuing, you're messing yourself up for the future of the industry. I mean, clearly sustainability was not a priority at this time, but you know, you can understand why, using this technique, whole species of egrets were almost totally killed off. And again, in this really brutal way. And like I said, people started writing about it, writing accounts of it. People started taking pictures of it. So these photos are from a famous series of photos depicting that. And people, largely women, started organizing to stop it. Yay! Thank you for organizing to stop it. The late 19th century and early 20th century was a really interesting time for American and European women in general. There was a boom in female activism, just lots of women getting together and organizing for social change. We're looking at 5 officers of the Women's League in Newport, Rhode Island in 1899. Women were doing things like mobilizing for workers' rights so workers could be treated fairly and safely. They were labor activists. Women were mobilizing for the temperance movement, so to outlaw booze and help reduce alcohol abuse and related domestic abuse. They were mobilizing for civil rights and women's rights. They were mobilizing to get the vote in England and US too. There were a lot of things that women from all different classes were starting to get together and get power to change, including protecting wildlife. So in the US, there was a 2-woman dream team that basically brought down the whole feather trade, and at the same time, jump-started the conservation movement in the US. And this is one of them. So she is a Boston socialite named Harriet Hemingway. And she was an amateur naturalist, so she was already into nature, and she was an avid birder. In 1896, when she's 38 years old, she reads one of these heartbreaking accounts of the hardcore slaughter of the snowy egret and other birds for the feather trade. And she's like, oh my God, this is horrible. Like, we have to stop this. We can't be killing these millions of birds in this horrible way and massacring whole species to extinction for hats. Like, this is insane. And she immediately marches across the street to her cousin's house. And her cousin is a woman named Minna B. Hall. So here's a portrait of Minna when she was younger. And Harriet tells Minna about everything. She explains the whole thing to her. And Minna's like, I'm down. Let's do this. And Harriet and Minna start strategizing on how to stop this feather trade. And they're like, okay, us women like us who are buying the most of these fancy fashionable hats and driving this murderous millinery trade. So we have to get these women to stop buying hats with feathers. We have to make it unfair. We have to change fashion to save birds. How are we going to do that? And they're like, let's party. Harriet and Minna kick off their revolution by inviting all the women on the Boston Blue Book social registry to a series of fancy tea parties. And at these parties, when they get them at these parties, they tell their guests all about the horrors of the feather trade. And they convince them to boycott feathered hats. So stop wearing the hats that they already have and stop buying hats with feathers. And they get them to tell all their friends about it too. So these are privileged society women, and they use their privilege to call out their friends, their family, and their peers on this issue. They fought to change the fashion, and they also fought to change the law. Harriet and Minna ultimately recruited 900 women to the cause, and this became the Massachusetts Audubon Society. And then all the other states started founding their own Audubon societies to join this fight against the feather trade. And these societies were about 80% women. So women are very strongly behind this effort to fight the feather trade. It's actually pretty amazing that Harriet and Minna's group grew to what became a national Audubon organization that helped create the first national wildlife refuge and the first national and international laws that protect wildlife. I mean, pretty crazy. So here is another killer fashion quiz for you. This one is about Harriet and Minna. And your question is, Harriet and Minna kicked off their movement in 1896. When did they get the first state law passed to protect wild birds? Do you think it was in 1897, 1899, 1903, or 1915? How long do you think it took them to get their first law passed?
Good question, Jen. Not sure. Answers are coming in. It's kind of mixed. All right, a few more seconds. Everybody, please get your votes in. This is anonymous. We will not be marking your quizzes and giving you any kind of a grade, but don't worry.
I think this is the least depressing of the quizzes. This is a positive feeling quiz.
Yes.
It looks like we have a tie here where I would say 41% went to 1899 and 41% went to 1903. 14% said 1915 and 5% said 1897. So let's see what it is. Okay, once Harriet and Minna have the Massachusetts Audubon Society, they immediately start using its political power. And just a year, 1 year, ladies and gentlemen, after they started throwing their parties, so in 1897, they had a state law passed outlawing trade in wild bird feathers. It only took them a year. Women didn't even have the vote then. And then in 1900, they get the Lacey Act passed, and that prohibits interstate shipment of animals killed in violation of local laws. So it doesn't matter if you killed it somewhere else, you can't like transport it around and sell it. And their efforts also led to the signing of the International Migratory Bird Treaty in 1916. This, in turn, led to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which was signed in 1918. And to this day, that remains one of the strongest laws protecting wild birds. And they were really the first kind of laws like this. These were landmark laws for conservation, which is part of the reason that Harriet and Minna are known as the mothers of conservation. And these laws that they helped to get passed are still protecting migratory birds and other birds today, including birds here on the island of St. Martin where I am. So thank you, ladies, for protecting our birds. Getting people to stop wearing these bird hats and outlawing the wild bird and feather trade was super divisive. So I thought it would be fun for us to do this quiz. There have been a lot of divisive issues lately, like wearing a mask to prevent COVID or equality protests or the recent US election. Like people feel very strongly about these things, but it can also be really hard to change someone's mind about it. So what could change your mind about a divisive issue? Epic party, expose in the news, conversation with friend or family member, discover a better alternative, or social and legal consequences. There's no right or wrong answer to this one. This is just, you know, different people are going to have different reasons for changing their mind. I'm just curious where people are netting out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are good answers, good options anyway. Lots of ways to change people's minds. All right, everybody get your votes in, a few more seconds.
It's hard to change someone's mind.
Yep.
It's hard to change people's mind about Harriet and Minna, you know, and these other amazing women actually used all of these techniques with what they were doing.
Yeah. Yeah. It seemed like. All right, here's the results.
Okay, looks like discover a better alternative is in the lead, followed by social or legal consequences, conversation, exposing the news tied with social or legal consequences. So educating yourself or being educated by a story, then conversation with friend or family member. Oddly, no one voted for epic party, yet it was so successful for Harriet and Minna. It could be something to keep in mind virtually right now, of course. But yeah, Harriet and Minna used all of these techniques, and they needed them because there was this super strong backlash against what they were doing. And the people benefiting the most from this wealthy plume industry didn't want to, you know, lose that money. And some people just didn't like it. Lisa, are we doing okay on time for me to share a little bit more?
Yeah, I think we're doing fine. If people have to drop off, they can always watch the recording, but I know you have a few more minutes, so hopefully people can stick around. It's been fascinating. Keep going.
All right, so I'm sure everyone listening will be shocked to hear that women just got blamed for the whole plume industry. So here we're looking at a political cartoon from the time. So there's a woman of fashion wearing a egret feather hat, sort of blissfully slaughtering nesting birds where their poor chicks look on. You can see the retriever dogs. I don't know if you can see, there's writing on the retriever dogs. They're labeled French milliner. So she's shooting and the milliners are just obediently fetching the birds that this vain and cruel woman is bringing down. Here's another cartoon. The feather-hatted woman is a bird of prey. You know, women couldn't win. Either they were completely vain, you know, heartlessly sacrificing birds for their vanity, or if they were boycotting feathered hats or trying to change people's mind, they were being uppity objectors to the status quo who were heartlessly putting people out of work. So it was like sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. Here is the extinction of this species. So this is the fashion plate lady without mercy, and the egrets. So you can see there were a lot of strong feelings that were happening. So talking about the various techniques that Harriet and Minna and the other amazing women and the Audubon societies were using to raise awareness and change people's behavior. So there's the parties where they're encouraging women to change their hat buying and wearing behavior and pressure their friends to do the same. They also sent literature, so they did a mail campaign. In Minna B. Hall's words, like, join a society for the protection of birds, especially the egret. So this is like a club. So you're either in or out of the club. And if you are choosing to be out and many other society women are in, how will you still be invited to the right balls and events? Because if you're off the list, then how will your sons and daughters marry other wealthy people? There was a social and a financial impact for the present and for the future. These women in societies also put articles in the newspaper. So this one directly links feathered hats, the slaughter of birds, and the murder of a warden who tried to stop plume hunters. So tying all of those things together. They would do direct interventions with people they knew socially, or they saw people on the street with feathered hats, and they would go up to them and talk to them. And this was often successful, but not always. We were just saying it's really hard to change people's minds. There's a great account by a woman named Celia Thaxter. She's a early activist, and she's trying to change someone's mind. And this woman is saying, there's a great deal of sentiment wasted on many of them. They will never be missed any more than mosquitoes. I shall put birds on my new bonnet. And Celia Thaxter tells us that this woman she was talking to was a fond and devoted mother, a cultivated and accomplished woman. But Celia keeps trying. And finally, this woman she's speaking with says to her, why do you give yourself so much trouble? They will soon go out of fashion, and that will be the end to it. And then Celia says, well, but fashion next year may order them back again. And how many women will have human feeling enough to refuse to wear them? So she's going hard at this lady. And she says, it was merely waste of breath, however. And she went on her way, a house of beaks and claws and bones and feathers and glass eyes upon her fatuous head. So it could feel really disappointing if you were not able to convince someone to, stop supporting this trade that was killing birds. And the Audubon groups also worked directly with milliners to provide alternatives to hats with wild birds and wild bird feathers. So they would actually sign agreements. They'd sign contracts with milliners where the milliners would agree not to use wild birds. It's amazing. You can see them in the archives. It's crazy. And then put on these like fancy birdless hat shows with, with these hats. And you don't need feathers to get that fashionable look of volume in a hat. You can use puffs of chiffon and silk or twists of ribbon. You can pile silk flowers on it, or you can create flower shapes from light fabrics. There's a lot you can do. And these were all options that were suggested as alternatives. And these wild bird friendly hats had a name. They were called Audubonnets. Audubonnets, isn't that great? This is an archival photo of a woman in an Audubonnet. So thank you to all these early activists for helping to save our birds. And a special thank you to BirdsCaribbean and Lisa for inviting me to do this talk. Thank you, Lisa Sorensen. And I want to thank my nonprofit, Les Fruits de Mer, and our museum, Amuseum Naturalis. I want to thank Mark Yokoyama for putting together this awesome presentation. And I want to thank all of you guys for coming and listening and tuning in. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar. Here's where you can contact us for more info.
All right.
And if you have any questions, I don't know if people have questions, you can ask me some questions or make comments. And Lisa, are you going to tell me what the questions are? I can't see the chat.
Yes, yeah. So thank you everybody for your excellent comments. We do have a few questions. So that was awesome, Jen. Really incredible photographs and history. I did not know all these details. It was really great. So we have a few good questions. Let me pose them to you. So Emma Lewis from Jamaica, she asked, were the birds imported, trafficked, already dead? How were tropical birds brought into the Europe, US, and was that legal?
So before they started making these laws in the US that Harriet and Minna, were instrumental in pushing through, people would go locally, but also to other places. So you could shoot birds around where you lived. You could kill birds in other places, and they would be transported dead. They weren't transported live. And wild birds were not really farmed. This was why it was decimating them so much. And then when they started to make laws, as the laws there was sort of this race where species were being decimated, so the birds are getting more and more rare. But then also the laws are getting stronger and stronger. So you go from that first law, which is just for the state of Massachusetts, and then they start growing the laws to be more strict, and then more national, and then finally international. By 1918, we have the International Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And after that time, it was technically illegal for people to shoot birds and transport their bodies or their feathers, as well as other wildlife around.
Okay. Yeah, thank goodness.
Yeah.
Okay. And Anki asks, how did they keep the feathers dry while transporting the feathers to Europe?
Oh, that's a really good question. So when I've seen pictures of what they're selling at so the plume hunters would sell to the feather traders who were usually in a place. So the plume hunters would be the ones, if somebody came to St. Martin and shot a bunch of snowy egrets, they would put them on a boat and then they would sell them to feather traders in New York or in Paris or London, one of these big markets. And then the feather traders would distribute them from there. So they're usually dealing with dead bodies. The pictures that I've seen have been boxes, so using boxes and wrapping birds in cloth, but I don't know if that was really widespread. There was that newspaper interview with that celebrity bird hunter, Egret Bennett. So I'm going to look at that again and see if he shares any of his techniques for transportation. But the ones that I've seen are boxes and cloth.
Yeah.
So sort of absorbing the moisturizer. And then they would take the feathers and, separate them from the birds and then sell them on or sell them as whole birds to taxidermy people, or they would sell the feathers to people who were going to prepare the feathers or the wings in those terrible environments.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah, I imagine they had to pack them very carefully so they wouldn't get damaged or wet or moldy or full of bugs or whatever.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to find out more about that. All right, we have a question from Hemant Kishan. He's actually an incredible bird photographer on Flickr. His username is Digital Plume Hunter, and he really has researched and written a lot about this on his blog and website. So I'm so happy he's joining us today. He asks, were European or Asian birds equally decimated by the plume trade? So was this all happening in Europe as well, or was it more of a US thing and they were shipping birds to Europe?
The hunters were coming from Europe and North America. They were hunting locally, but they were also going to other places to do it. So London and New York were the feather markets that were buying the most, but Paris also bought a ton. But the feather hunters, like that celebrity one I was talking about, Egret Bennett, he like wiped out the egret almost throughout Mexico. And that's why, you know, he sort of, as he wiped it out in one place, he'd move on to the next season.
Colony, right.
So I don't have exact numbers. I would love to know if anyone wants to do that research, but it wasn't something like Europeans weren't hunting at all, or Europeans were only hunting locally. There was a lot of like local and travel for hunting these species.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And Emma is wondering, do you think feathered hats will come back into fashion? And she comments, I hate hats.
That's kind of the thing, right? So back in the day, hats in general were something that you had to wear.
Right.
And now, like it, you know, that picture of the street, like all those archival images, or if anyone has ever seen like archival, like on the street footage, if you look at the people in those who are out, you know, outside on the street in those videos and in those pictures, they're all wearing hats. And if you did the same thing today, you would not see very many hats unless it was like a place where it was cold and people were keeping their heads warm. So there's not this social pressure to cover your head in that way. So if feathers came back into fashion, first of all, they wouldn't be able to use wild birds because there are laws against it. And second of all, if feathers did come back into fashion for hats, they'd be using like chicken feathers and stuff like that and dyeing them and trying to make them look like wild bird hats. And there's just not that many hats being worn. So I think first you'd have to make hats come back, and then make, you know, and then advocate for feathers to go on those hats. So if you hate hats, this is a good time to live because they're not very popular.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine them being sort of mandatory in fashion like they were 100 years ago. I mean,
Yeah.
not mandatory in fashion anymore, I guess. All right, so let's take a question from Facebook. We had quite a few watchers on Facebook, which is awesome. Jasmine asked, did milliners signing the contracts feel pressured, or was it an opportunity to show they were in fashion?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So I've looked at some of the archival contracts, like you can find them, they've been scanned. And they're very strongly worded. They're clearly created by the Audubon societies. And they're legal documents. So, and the movement was so strong to stop hats with feathers, and there was so much publicity about it. There must have been a pretty big pressure on milliners, like if they were producing so many feathered hats and now no one was going to buy them. If they wanted people to come to their hat store instead of the other hat store, they would have to produce hats with these alternative materials. But then by the same token, when you think about how expensive these feathers were and these bird corpses were, it seems like it would save the money. So it would be an opportunity. Like if I'm just making up these numbers, but like, let's say you're gonna sell a hat for $200, but if you had to pay $100 to get the feather that you're putting on that hat, whereas if you're creating like a beautiful feathery volume out of chiffon and spending 50 cents to get that chiffon, your profit is gonna be bigger. So I think that there was probably a moral high ground. Like we looked at one of those newspaper ads from the milliner promoting themselves as having Audubon millinery. Like they're saying, we have the new style, this is the new fashion. So I think it was a little bit of both. There was an opportunity to save money on feathers and gain this new market, but then there was also the threat of, well, what do I do with all the feathers I already have? Or,
True.
you know, I don't want people to stop going to my place because I have feathers. And they actually worked with them on stuff like, okay, so for birds that are farmed, like ostrich, you know, or, you know, chickens, or, you know, how can you transform those feathers into feathers that look like wild bird feathers? So that's something the Audubon groups did as well. They're like, those kind of feathers, I guess they're okay. So they sort of did a little compromise with these milliners in this way. But yeah,
makes
a
sense.
little bit of both. I think the answer is it was both. They were pressured, but it was also an opportunity.
Pressure, the economics of it, the laws, everything. I mean, it makes me think of the fur trade, you know, and just the revolt against using wild animals for fur.
Imagine they had invested insane amounts of money in the hats that were already finished, and then the feathers that they hadn't used yet.
Right.
So they, you know, they definitely took a loss once it was against the law and against the fashion to sell those hats.
Yep. All right, let's see. Another question. What are fake feathers made of these days? Anki asks. I mean, is there an earth-friendly alternative? You mentioned chickens.
So you have two choices for fake feathers. So you can either use materials that are not from birds at all. So you can duplicate the look with like fine silken threads, or using puffs of chiffon or puffs of silk, or ribbons. You know, you can create a shape with ribbons and wire that looks like a feather or looks feathery. And then the second choice is to take feathers that are not from wild birds. So they wouldn't be against the law because they're not wild birds. So taking chicken feathers, or farmed ostrich plumes, goose feathers, swan feathers, any birds that are raised and used for food, and that are not wild birds. You could take those feathers and you could kind of cut them into pieces and put them together so that they look like wild bird feathers. You could dye them if you're looking for a certain color that certain wild bird feathers have. Like if you want to imitate the blue of those kingfisher feathers, you could bleach and dye chicken feathers to do that. So one would be like totally fake it, like from go. And the second would be fake it out of feathers that are not wild bird feathers.
Right. Yeah. And Roger Nichols from Trinidad comments that here in Trinidad, they used to slaughter the scarlet ibis to adorn the carnival costume. So you can imagine how many ibis were slaughtered each year for carnival. Yeah. And it became illegal after the populations became noticeably diminished. And as such, it became the national bird of Trinidad, protected by law. Awesome. Thanks for that background. And he says now artificial feathers are being acquired instead, as well as from the poultry industry. So yeah, I'm glad we found those alternative solutions.
That's a very happy ending to the ibis story on the island.
Yeah, I know, it's such an incredible bird. Anybody that's been to Caroni Swamp and seen them flying into roost. All right, so Marie Richardson, we'll just cover a couple more questions before we sign off. Marie Richardson asks, it would be interesting to know the percentage of the membership, she means Audubon membership, that consists of women. Do they make up a large percentage now? Do you know? Is it?
Oh, I don't know. I would be really curious to find out.
That is a good question. I would be interested too. Maybe you can contact somebody at the Audubon Society and see what their membership breakdown is. That's a good question. Sorry, Marie, we don't know, but we'll try to find out the answer and get back to you. All right, and Carolyn asks, what can we do to make fashion more sustainable and cruelty-free? In addition to bringing back the captain.
Wow, that's such a big question. I think moving away from fast fashion. So, you know, part of the problem with these hats, like whether they were feathered or not, was that people were there was a ton of chemicals used to produce them. The Mad Hatter, he went mad from the chemicals used in making hats. There was like arsenic was being used. So it was like terrible for the workers, but also people were just buying tons of new hats all the time, like for upper class women. We talked about how much they were buying. So if we're buying new clothes every season, like not just because there's a hole in our shorts and we can't mend it, so we need a new pair of shorts, but if we're shopping for fashion and shopping for trends in a fast fashion method, then that's not sustainable. So changing that behavior, choosing well-made quality outfits that last, mending and tailoring outfits, and then also choosing things that aren't produced in a horrible way, that aren't produced in sweatshops and are produced with material that doesn't hurt the environment, to make.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, and then to know that, you need transparency in the industry to inform the consumer. So it's about personal behavior, personal choices, knowledge, legal transparency, a social movement to change it, and then these legal consequences, maybe for not, for having sweatshops and having poor treatment of workers or producing something that's horrible for the environment. If you raise a bunch of trees to grow cotton, cotton's a natural fabric, but was that a great choice? There's a lot of layers to that.
It's a complicated question.
Like there's a lot of layers to the bird hat question as well. So things we should be thinking about.
Yeah,
definitely.
Very good questions to think about. I think, the whole reduce, reuse, recycle, reuse things. Don't buy things that you just use once and throw away. Buy things that are reusable. Buy fashion that's timeless, like the caftan. All right.
Comfortable will fit you at any size.
Comfortable, fit you, all the comfortable clothes that we're all wearing at home now. All right, so Emma is asking, did the women focus on the fur trade also? I noticed that activists were all wearing fox stoles. Do you know about that?
Yes, there was a lot of animal fur that was popular at the time. Now, Lisa, you might know more about this than me, but I believe that these wildlife protection laws that were passed in 1918 also cover other wildlife? Or is it just the Lacey Act from 1900 that says you can't shoot any wild thing and transport it?
Yeah,
I don't know about the fur side of it. I know that, when there was a big backlash against fur, I'm remembering it as happening in the 80s and 90s, they used some of the same techniques, to make it morally incorrect and unfashionable to wear fur. But certainly in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, people were, fur was still like this luxury item that people loved wearing around. So maybe there would be like a difference between shooting wild animals to make furs and then domestically farming like minks, like mink farming, or, if you farm the animal that you're getting the fur from I'm assuming at a certain time that would have been very different from shooting a wild animal and, harvesting the fur from that. So there might have been two phases to that as well, if that helps.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's all related. And you and I were talking last night about hunting of wild game, and the passenger pigeon was the most numerous, most abundant bird probably on the planet, and it was shot to extinction from, just in a matter of a few years. So it's incredible how destructive humans can be. We do sometimes learn from our mistakes, but we've still got a lot of work to do with so many issues related to birds and bird conservation. Caged birds, that's a big issue, trapping wild birds and keeping them in cages. we have that issue in the Caribbean and other parts of the world as well. So if anybody still has questions, I invite you to just put them maybe in the Facebook page or write to Jenn at info at was it go back one slide maybe? Yeah, info at birdscaribbean.org or info at lefuidemare.com. And we would love to have you follow us on social media, join us, follow, get our newsletters and so forth. Thanks again for joining us, Jenn. That was amazing. And we will have this video available on our YouTube channel and website. So look for that in a few days. And everybody have a great rest of the day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you, Adriana, for the translation. That was super helpful. We did have a few Spanish speakers on, so that was great.
Sure, take care. Bye.
Okay, bye everybody. Take care.
Bye.